The choir director said she needed someone who knew gospel and could hold a congregation. The man in the third row said he thought he could manage. She had no idea who she was talking to until he opened his mouth. It was the morning of Sunday, March 11th, 1962, and the Greater Mount Calvary Baptist Church on Hernando Street in Memphis was 2 hours from the most important performance its gospel choir had attempted in 11 years. The occasion was the Southern Regional Gospel Convocation, a gathering that brought together choirs from across Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas, and which rotated between host churches on a schedule that meant Mount Calvary had been waiting for its turn since 1951. The program had been in preparation for 4 months. The choir had rehearsed every Wednesday evening and every Sunday afternoon since November. The repertoire was locked, the arrangements were set, the soloists had their parts, and the congregation that would fill the pews at 11 o'clock would include visiting pastors, choir directors, and music scholars from 3 states who had traveled specifically to hear what Mount Calvary's choir could do. At 9:17 in the morning, the choir's lead soloist, a man named Robert Dawes, who had been singing gospel for 31 years and whose voice was, by the assessment of everyone who had heard it, the reason Mount Calvary had been selected to host the convocation in the first place, collapsed in the church parking lot. He was conscious and responsive. It would turn out to be a cardiac episode serious enough to require hospitalization, but not the catastrophe the initial fear suggested. But he was not going to sing that morning, and the ambulance that arrived 12 minutes later made that fact final. The choir director's name was Sister Dorothy May Watkins. She was 58 years old and had been directing the Mount Calvary Choir for 19 years, and she was, by every account of the people who worked with her, a woman of remarkable composure in difficult circumstances. The composure held while she organized the ambulance response, held while she made the calls that needed to be made, held while she spoke to the choir assembled in the rehearsal room and told them what had happened. It held until she was standing alone in the small corridor between the rehearsal room and the main sanctuary, where it briefly and entirely did not hold. And then it came back, because Dorothy May Watkins was not the kind of woman who stayed in a corridor for long when there was a problem that required solving. She went into the sanctuary. The sanctuary at 9:45 on a Sunday morning was not empty. There were always people who came early, members who needed the quiet before the service, visitors who had arrived from out of town and had nowhere else to be, the occasional person who was there for reasons that had nothing to do with the service at all and everything to do with the particular quality of stillness that a church holds in the hour before it fills with people. There were perhaps 12 people in the pews when Dorothy May walked in from the side door and stood at the front and said, in the clear, direct voice of a woman who had been projecting to large rooms for 19 years, that she needed a moment of everyone's attention. She explained the situation plainly. Robert Dawes was on his way to the hospital. The convocation would begin in a little over an hour. She needed someone who knew gospel music, not casually, not culturally, but in the body, the way you know something when you have spent years inside it, and who could stand before a congregation that included some of the most knowledgeable gospel listeners in the region and hold the room. She said she understood this was an extraordinary thing to ask of a stranger, and that she was asking anyway, because the situation required it. She looked at the 12 people in the pews. Most of them looked back at her with the expressions of people who are genuinely sympathetic to a problem and genuinely unable to help with it. A deacon near the front said he could try, with the honest qualification that trying was the most he could offer. A woman in the second row said she had sung in a choir 20 years ago. A man near the back said he played harmonica, which was not what was needed, but was offered in the spirit of willingness that the moment seemed to call for. The man in the third row had not spoken. He was sitting slightly apart from the other early arrivals in the middle of the pew rather than at the end, which was where people usually sat when they wanted to be able to leave easily. He was in his late 20s, dark-haired, casually dressed in a way that suggested he had not come expecting to be seen by anyone in particular. He had been in the sanctuary for about 20 minutes when Dorothy May came in, and he had been sitting in the particular way of someone who came to church to sit in a church rather than to attend a service, present, quiet, not performing anything. When Dorothy May finished speaking, he sat for a moment with his hands resting on the pew in front of him. Then he said that he thought he could manage. Dorothy May looked at him. She was a careful woman and a discerning one, and she had spent 19 years learning to read the people who came through her choir's doors, who had the thing and who thought they had the thing, which were very different categories. She looked at the man in the third row and applied that 19 years of discernment to what she saw. And what she saw was not the nervousness of someone offering more than they had, or the eagerness of someone who wanted to be helpful and was hoping helpfulness would be enough. What she saw was the stillness of someone who had made an honest assessment and was giving an honest answer. She said, "Come up here and let me hear something." She said it without thinking about it for very long, which was itself a form of information. Dorothy Mae Watkins was not a woman who acted on unexamined impulse. She had been in situations that required quick decisions for 19 years, and she had learned to distinguish between the quick decisions that came from genuine discernment and the quick decisions that came from desperation, which were not the same thing and did not produce the same results. This one felt like the first kind. She could not have explained precisely why. She filed the uncertainty and moved toward what the situation needed. He came to the front of the sanctuary. He stood at the position where Robert Dawes would have stood in the curve of the altar rail, and he looked at Dorothy Mae and asked what she needed. She said she needed to hear how he handled a congregation. She said to sing something, anything he knew, and let her listen. He stood for a moment with his hands at his sides. Then he began to sing. He sang without accompaniment, without setup, without the preliminary adjustments that singers make when they are warming up or demonstrating. He simply began, the way people begin things that are in them rather than things they are producing. The song was a gospel standard that Dorothy Mae had known for 40 years, a piece she could have sung in her sleep, and she had heard it performed by soloists of every level from her 19 years of directing and from the convocations she had attended across the region. She had not heard it sung like this. It was not a matter of volume or range, though both were extraordinary. It was the quality underneath those things, the quality that gospel musicians and gospel congregations call anointing, and that does not have a precise secular equivalent. The sense that the music is coming from somewhere deeper than technique, that it has been lived in rather than learned. She had heard singers with better technical credentials produce less of it. She had heard singers with no formal training at all produce more of it. It was not something that could be manufactured or performed. It was either present or it was not. It was present. Dorothy Mae stood at the front of the sanctuary and listened, and the 12 people in the pews listened, and the sanctuary held the sound the way good sanctuaries hold sound, and nobody moved. A deacon who had offered to try moments earlier and been honest about the limits of his trying sat in his pew with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor and listened. The woman who had said she had sung in a choir 20 years ago had tears on her face within 90 seconds. Which she would mention to her daughter that afternoon as the fastest she had ever been moved by anything. The man who had offered the harmonica had put the harmonica in his jacket pocket and was sitting with his eyes closed. When he finished, the silence lasted several seconds. Dorothy Mae said, "What is your name?" He told her. The silence that followed his answer was of a different quality from the silence that had followed the singing. This one was the silence of 12 people simultaneously recalibrating something. Dorothy Mae stood with this for a moment. Then she said, "Can you be ready in an hour?" He said he could. What followed at the 11 o'clock convocation was something that the people who were present spoke about for years afterward with the particular care that people bring to describing things they are not entirely sure they can account for. There is a challenge in trying to describe excellence in a medium as immediate and unrepeatable as live singing. The words available for it tend toward the superlative in a way that makes them sound like exaggeration, even when they are not. People who had been there said they tried over the years to tell others what the morning had been like and found that the telling was always smaller than the thing. This is not a complaint. It is the nature of the thing. Music that reaches the level that music occasionally reaches does not survive the translation into language. It survives in the people who were present in the specific way they carry it afterward, which is different from how they carry other memories. The choir performed with a quality that Dorothy Mae said later was the best she had ever heard them produce. Not because Robert Dawes had been replaced by someone better, but because something in the room that morning had raised the level of everything. The visiting choir directors and music scholars who filled the pews were not an easy audience. They were people who heard gospel music professionally and could hear the difference between what was being offered and what was being attempted. What they heard that morning was not an attempt. Between the choir's pieces, he sang 3 solos. The first was from the program, a piece the choir had rehearsed with Robert Dawes and that had been arranged around his voice, which meant the arrangement had to be adjusted in real time to accommodate a different instrument. He adjusted it himself, quietly, before the choir came in the 30 seconds between the choir director's signal and his first note. Dorothy Mae watched him do it, and felt something she had not felt in a long time in a professional context, which was the specific reassurance of competence. The knowledge that the person beside you knows what they are doing and does not need to be managed. The second one, a slow, searching rendition of a hymn that the convocation program had not listed, that he had apparently decided on during the service itself, produced in the Mount Calvary Sanctuary, something that Dorothy May had witnessed only a few times in 19 years of directing. Several members of the congregation were crying. Not in the dramatic way that revival meetings sometimes produced, but in the quiet, private way that happens when music reaches something specific inside a person, and that person had not known it was reachable. A visiting pastor from Jackson, Mississippi, who had attended regional gospel convocations for 22 years, said afterward that he had not heard anything like it since he was 17 years old in his grandmother's church in rural Alabama, when an old man had stood up during the service without being invited and sung a single verse of a hymn that had changed the quality of the air in the room. Dorothy May thanked him after the service in the corridor outside the sanctuary with the directness and specificity that she brought to everything. She said he had given her choir something they would carry for years. She said she meant that literally, that the standard they had reached that morning would become the standard they measured themselves against. He said the choir had done the work. He said he had just tried to keep up. She looked at him for a moment and decided not to argue. Robert Dawes recovered fully and returned to the Mount Calvary Choir 6 weeks later. He was told what had happened in his absence. He sat with the account for a while before he said anything. Then he said he was sorry he had missed it. And he said it in the particular way of a man who understood exactly what he had missed. The convocation was written about in 2 regional church publications the following month. Neither account named the soloist, which was at Dorothy May's request. She had felt, when she thought about it afterward, that naming him would change the story in a way that diminished its most important element, which was not who had shown up, but that he had shown up and that she had let him. The accounts described him as a Memphis musician who stepped in at the last hour and left it at that. People who had been present and who knew who the Memphis musician was did not volunteer the information to anyone who asked, partly out of respect for Dorothy May's preference, and partly because they understood as she did that the story was better without that particular detail foreground. Dorothy May Watkins directed the Mount Calvary Choir for another 14 years before her retirement. She spoke about that Sunday morning occasionally when the occasion warranted it, at choir retreats, in conversations with young directors she was mentoring. Once in a sermon she was asked to give on the subject of grace arriving in unexpected forms. She always told the story the same way. She said that on the morning of March 11, 1962, she had walked into her own sanctuary desperate and had asked 12 strangers for help, and one of them had said he thought he could manage, and she had almost said no because she didn't know who he was, and she had said yes instead because of something in the stillness of the way he sat in the pew. She said that was the lesson. Not who he was. The stillness. She said she had spent a long time thinking about what would have happened if she had looked at the man in the 3rd row and decided that she already knew what he had to offer before she asked him to come to the front and sing. She said she thought about it every time she was tempted to make that kind of decision about anyone. She said the man in the 3rd row had a way of teaching that lesson without knowing he was teaching it, and that this was probably the most effective way to teach anything.